Most defendants accept their fate and move on. But when Pam was hit with a sudden fine, she fought back with such precision that even the judge was left questioning his own ruling. Pam never expected the day to start like this. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another stop in her schedule. A quick hearing, nothing more. She'd been in this room dozens of times facing judges with varying levels of experience. But nothing about today seemed out of the ordinary. She sat at the defendant's table, her expression neutral, as she glanced through a few notes. Across from her, a city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting in his seat as he waited for the judge to enter. The case was a minor dispute. At least that's what it was supposed to be. A procedural matter that wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, Pam knew something was off. Dalton was a man who commanded the room without saying much. Tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes, he carried an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Normally, judges took a moment to review files, give a nod to the attorneys, and settle in before making any remarks. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, expression unreadable. Pam straightened slightly, sensing the shift in tone. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued. "And after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of local statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately." Silence. Pam's brow lifted just slightly, but inside her mind was already working. She had expected an argument, a discussion, maybe even a warning. But this, a summary judgment without a word of discussion? The city attorney glanced at her, almost apologetic. Even he hadn't expected the case to move this fast. Pam calmly folded her hands, her voice even. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The room was still too still. She wasn't the kind of attorney to lose her composure, but something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling. This was a statement. She glanced at Dalton, studying him. There was something behind his eyes, a confidence that went beyond simple judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on a case. He was putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That was when she knew. This wasn't just about the case. It was about her. Pam adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She'd fought bigger battles. But the principle? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted again, uncomfortable. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at the legal brief in front of her, though she didn't really need it. She already knew what she was going to do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. But before anyone could speak again, Pam raised her hand, a signal that she wasn't finished, and what came next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Pam let the silence linger just long enough to make an impact. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. She simply turned one page in her folder, more for effect than necessity, before finally looking up at Judge Dalton. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear, and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly as if she were studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." Pam leaned back just a little, keeping her tone casual. "It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's What's the phrase, unprecedented? Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him yet, but she was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and law clerks, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who'd probably seen 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands and we move on. Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He'd opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time, she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, for example, Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under the statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was completely silent. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it too. Dalton straightened, his tone sharpening. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned another page. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Reynolds versus Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure, Your Honor, you wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh without amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but important. She had shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position, rather than simply issuing rulings without question. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly up until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes stayed locked on Pam. There was a long pause. Then finally the judge spoke. Very well, you may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. Judge Dalton didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control. He wanted to make sure she understood exactly where she stood in his courtroom, but she wasn't the type to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Let's start with the language of the statute itself. She tapped her papers. Local Statute 14B claims that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough. But the issue arises in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, looking unimpressed. And yet, Ms. Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient? Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Ms. Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam allowed a beat of silence before responding. Except when it isn't, a murmur from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document and held it up. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute. Same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused for emphasis. You know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw said enough. The city attorney leaned in slightly. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us. The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, his eyes scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle where he could regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't even blink. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear or it isn't. Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had the judge cornered, not because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made now would be under scrutiny. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned, or he could backpedal, which would mean conceding that he had acted prematurely. Pam didn't envy his position, but then again, he was the one who had put himself there. Dalton let out a slow breath. Ms. Pam, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam smiled slightly. Then let's debate it. The judge's nostrils flared slightly. Then, to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He stood before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm, but inside she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. Pam walked into what she expected to be just another routine hearing, but by the end of the day, she had achieved a significant legal victory. Initially facing the judge, Raymond Dalton, who immediately approved a simple fine, she was belittled. However, Bondi refused to back down. She calmly presented her legal expertise and courage, turning the situation around in her favor. In the face of a judge who dismissed her right to present a defense and made swift, authoritarian decisions, Bondi remained composed, providing a deep analysis and mounting a strong defense. Challenging Dalton's decision, Bondi thoroughly explained how the existing law was vague and its applicability debatable. She cited both local and state-level rulings to reveal the flaws in Dalton's approach. In the end, she not only secured the dismissal of the fine, but also sent a powerful message about the importance of a fair and just legal system. Her victory was not just about overturning the fine, it emphasized that the law must apply equally to everyone. Pam, through her determination and legal knowledge, demonstrated that true power isn't about titles or positions, but about understanding the law and standing firm when others expect you to back down. This case became a landmark, not only for her own clients, but for the legal system at large, showing that even the smallest steps in challenging the system can lead to big changes. Pam's success serves as a reminder that the law isn't just about enforcement, it's about understanding it, fighting for it, and ensuring it's applied fairly. It wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory for justice itself.